in this as we all begin to deal with what is this apparent tragedy. Number one, you heard the plea to anyone who might have gone outside armed with a video camera. Obviously, the television networks have been playing various views of this catastrophe all day, but more importantly, the civic duty with such videotape is to hand it over, such was the plea here, to NASA. They will be piecing together all available views of the eventual crash of the debris, what was left of this space shuttle, as they get them from citizens. A lot of what we have been playing today is amateur video, people who heard the noise and went outside in Texas to take pictures of it. We have this on the debris shield from the Associated Press. An East Texas sheriff says debris may be floating down for hours. We should quickly note this is a sheriff and not a NASA scientist, and we don't know if this stretches what we know about how long it takes something to fall from an altitude of 39 miles. The Cherokee County Sheriff James Campbell says debris is reported to be falling in a concentrated area between the towns of Jacksonville, Palestine, Rusk, and Athens in East Texas. This report is 20 minutes old. Highly doubt, however, that it'll be falling for a matter of hours. We do know about some of the pieces on the ground. Scott Gordon, a correspondent for NBC television station KXAS, is with us. He's been patiently standing by from where one of the larger pieces has been identified and located. Scott?
Well, Brian, we're here in the town of Rice, Texas, about 45 miles or so southeast of Dallas. We're here on the front lawn of the Rice High School. Let me step out of the way and show you what we've got here. You can see the yellow tape has been set up around what everyone here believes, no confirmation, but what everyone here believes is a small piece of the shuttle. You can see that small rectangular object to the right side of that yellow pole. That's it. It's a charred piece, apparently of tile, apparently a piece of the shuttle that fell to ground here in Rice, Texas this morning. We're getting similar reports of a similar type debris throughout this area. With us now live is State Trooper Dane Baker with the Texas Department of Public Safety. Trooper, what can you tell us about how this was discovered this morning?
It's still unknown exactly who discovered the item. It was notified to the local sheriff's department, who there informed us to come to the scene and secure the area because it possibly being a hazardous material and make sure nobody touches the item.
Now, this is a relatively small piece of debris. How many similar reports are you getting throughout East Texas here of similar type debris?
We've had several unconfirmed reports throughout the area. A lot of them have been unfounded. Still, we're waiting to get officers and troopers over to those other locations so we can secure the areas and get someone who can officially identify the items.
And we can see a lot of people here. It's becoming a little bit of an attraction here. Are you afraid that people here may be too close? Is there any concern or any danger?
Right now, we just set the perimeter up the best that we can and do advise people to stay clear as best as we can. It's all we can do at this point.
All right, Dane Baker, thank you very much. As Trooper with the Texas Department of Public Safety here. So Brian, that's a situation here in East Texas. One small piece of debris over my shoulder, and there's a lot of other similar type debris all throughout this area that they're finding.
Scott, our thanks to you for that report. Scott Gordon, again, a correspondent with NBC television station KXAS, and a reminder for people who may approach pieces of debris, and it is over an area of several hundred miles, as best we can understand it. The propellants used on the shuttle are toxic, say nothing of the fact that this is all now evidence and should not be touched. Officials are saying don't even go near it if you see it. The Air National Guard is up over a several hundred-mile wide area. They're using some sort of airborne sensors to see if they can find debris lying on the ground. The National Forest Service has a lot of acreage underneath the area identified as the debris field. They will be dispatching employees to go over as much as they can of federal land. So in so many counties and across so many hundred miles right now, there's a huge effort to get people to fan out as long as daylight lasts, at least what's the remainder of Saturday, to find what has come down from the sky. We're going to go back to a gentleman who was so helpful in describing what happened. He was home at the time. Bob Moulter is with us from Palestine, Texas. And Bob, again, tell us what you first saw and first heard.
Okay, Brian, it was approximately 8:09 this morning, and there was a loud, extended noise, like a continuous explosion, and my entire house was shaking. And living close to a railroad tracks on a major line, I thought that perhaps, there had been a major derailment or explosion over there, and I walked outside, looked towards the tracks. The ground was still shaking, and the noise was still, rumbling on. And when I looked up above me, there was a very large smoke plume, but it was in a spiral or a swirling type motion headed towards the southeast. And as I watched it, I was looking towards the sun. There was a glow near the front of it. If you've seen, obviously you have, the reports on television, I've come to find out that was a vapor trail, but what was shown on television, if you magnified that 10 or 15 times, that was the width of it when it was over me here in Palestine. It continued on for well over a minute, maybe a minute and a half, before it began to dissipate the sound, and then I lost sight of it into the sun to the southeast.
Bob, as far as we can tell, everyone who has had a different view of this, and everyone has a different story to tell, over some portions of Texas it was still whole, and then later on it broke up into several pieces, and we now know the pieces as small as tiles and even smaller are landing on the ground. But the entire width of the sky, you saw it as one piece?
No, sir, I could not say that it was one piece. It would be hard for me to discern where I was standing how many pieces it was. I can very definitively say it was not one piece.
Okay, and the roar was something like a sonic boom?
It would be like a prolonged sonic boom. I've mentioned to people if they've ever heard a tornado, or someone gave me another analogy. If you were to stand right next to a freight train moving at a very high rate of speed and listen to the entire train go by, that would be the intensity of the sound.
And for how many seconds do you estimate?
I'm estimating between a minute and a minute and a half.
Bob Moulter, thank you very much for joining us once again from Palestine, Texas. We are joined now by a former astronaut, shuttle astronaut, Richard Houck. And Mr. Houck, thank you for being with us. If memory serves, you flew the first shuttle that went up after the Challenger mission, correct?
Right, Brian. Listening to Mr. Mulder, I can only conclude that what he heard was the reason it was such an extended sonic boom. Many of those parts create their own sonic boom. So whereas if you have one space shuttle passing overhead, you expect to hear a boom boom, very short, staccato-like. But if you've got a lot of pieces there, you've got a conflagration of many pieces, each creating their own sonic boom, so the fact that it was prolonged does not surprise me.
How active have you stayed in the program? And I have the unfortunate task of asking if you knew personally any of the crew members believed lost today.
I did not know any of them personally. I've been close to NASA and have worked with them on several committees over the years, but I left shortly after my last flight and have been in private business since then.
Tell us about the shuttle program. Obviously, the huge setback back in '86 after Challenger, and then we, as we've been discussing all day, we kind of got blasé and complacent about it. People didn't notice the coverage anymore. The average American couldn't tell you if there was a shuttle up at any given time, and here we are, jolted back into paying attention to the space program.
Right, it's hard to believe that there have been over 100 space shuttle missions. Back then, of course, there's some stark contrast between this accident and the Challenger tragedy. Of course, the Challenger occurred right at liftoff. The actual problem did, and because there was so much coverage, NASA coverage, video coverage of that liftoff, they were able to zero in on that problem fairly quickly as being hot gases escaping from the solid rocket booster. Another big difference, of course, is most of the debris fell into the water off of the coast there, and so that in some ways hampered the collection of debris. In some ways, we're fortunate that this happened over the United States. I hope that no one was hurt on the ground, but access to the debris, as long as the public is helpful in bringing it to NASA's attention, that should be very helpful. the question of how much telemetry data was coming down from the space shuttle will be very interesting. I don't know if, in fact, it is typical now for there to be a loss of data during re-entry. It certainly was typical when I was flying, just because of the great plasma sheath of electricity that builds around the shuttle as it comes through the Earth's atmosphere. So that would be a question that would be interesting to ask. Did they have data right up to the time of breakup, or were they in the period of what they call blackout?
So this is a point in landing where it is possible that some screens, some aspects of the intelligence and telemetry they were getting went blank and are accustomed to do so.
As far as I know, as I say, there may be more powerful transmitters and receivers than during the time I was flying, and so that time frame may be less, or may not. There may not be a blackout period, but that's a good question to ask.
We've been talking, sir, about the character of the people who were up today, and generally those who are attracted to the space program, and the following may require you to cast modesty aside, but what is different about you and your colleagues, that you made a conscious decision not to pursue a lifetime in the insurance business or law enforcement or anything else, but you took a measurable risk, a 1 in 75 chance of catastrophic failure? Why?
Well, first of all, of course, you believe it cannot happen to me, but everyone that gets into the Space Shuttle program, like many other adventurers, that's the key. You are adventurous. You seek pushing the envelope. When I speak to groups, I'll ask, how many of you are downhill skiers? And if they raise their hands, I say, you'd probably like to be an astronaut. There are a lot of parallels there. The beauty of the Earth, the chances that you take, the thrill, the rush. So these are adventurous people, and clearly to be selected by NASA to fly in the Space Shuttle, they have to have extraordinary talent.
Talk about the esprit de corps. These 7 have been together for so long now. They were said to be, sounded so happy over the downlink, the live coverage, even their conversations on just prior to re-entry today.
Well, it's a time for elation. Here you are, you've just completed a 16-day mission, you've seen the beauty of the Earth, you've contributed to the development of science, of learning how we might spend more time in space, maybe even going on to Mars, and now you've suited up, you're strapped into your seats, and you're coming back home. What a wonderful time. There's very little for the crew to do at that point. The shuttle is controlled automatically. The pilot and the commander are monitoring all the dials and the equipment and ready to take over if there's something that happens that you could cope with. But all you really have to do is look out the window, and passing over the great northwest of the United States, Canada, and coming down over the central United States heartland, I'm sure they were looking out the window at sunrise and just marveling at the view.
Mr. Huck, I want to share with you something just handed to me from Johnson Space Center, Houston, Associated Press. It sounded like routine communication, but now it has taken on a whole new meaning. The communication message was heard shortly before 9 a.m. Eastern. It starts with a mission controller at the Johnson Space Center saying, Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last. A reply comes from an astronaut believed to be Shuttle Commander Rick Husband, who says, Roger. And then here is the crucial part of what we know. The transmission then breaks off after the crew member starts to say a word beginning with the sound buh, and it's spelled here B-U-H. And I guess anything at this point, Mr. Houck, would be pure speculation. Pure
speculation. Of course, the tire pressure, that refers to the landing gear that is nestled. I have a model here.
As do we, yeah.
Okay, well, the tires are nestled right up here into the bottom of the space shuttle, and the tire pressures are continuously monitored because it could cause a problem if the tires were flat upon landing. To speculate on why the tire pressures would change, the only thing that I can think of is if there was increased heating back in that area.
We were having a conversation earlier with Buzz Aldrin, and expressing the very American hope that they didn't know this was coming, that no one felt anything, these 7 souls on board. He feared the opposite was true, that maybe they had some prior indication that something had gone wrong, as we now believe the Challenger astronauts do. It's delving into the unthinkable.
Yes, it is. It's Well, it didn't last long, obviously a matter of minutes, but it's terrible to think of, but it's life.
And back up to your explanation of why people say it sounded like a sustained noise of a freight train going by. When you're doing Mach 18, it also, by extension, means that all the parts of your spacecraft that may separate are also doing Mach 18, correct?
Absolutely, and depending upon how massive they are, they will be slowed down in the atmosphere at different speeds. For example, the main engines are very massive, and they would travel a lot farther downrange before they broke up than, say, the tiles. There are 20,000 of those little 8 by 8 inch tiles on the bottom of the space shuttle. I think we saw a picture of one down near Rice, Texas High School. I'm quite sure that's what it was. As far as speculation of debris coming down minutes or hours afterwards, I can perceive of flight documentation, papers or whatever, if it's caught up in the jet stream. Of course, this breakup occurred above the jet stream, and that is masses of wind moving over 100 miles an hour. Paper could be carried hundreds of miles.
As we look at this, have you been at all critical of modernization, the pace of change at NASA, whether or not this still makes sense given where science is, where flight technology is, as the best vehicle to be doing this?
No, I have not been critical. The Space Shuttle is an incredible vehicle. It requires a tremendous amount of maintenance and oversight, and NASA, I believe, is giving the proper oversight and maintenance to it. Of course, there's discussion now as to the next generation space shuttle. Should we develop one? And I believe that's Mr. O'Keefe, the administrator of NASA, has started an initiative there. But I have never had the sense that there's been a disregard of safety issues as it relates to the space shuttle.
Richard Houck, who we should remind our audience is the brave man that Jay Barbary was talking about earlier, who piloted the shuttle flight that went up after the catastrophic loss of the Challenger. Mr. Houck, you're very kind to join us from Washington today.
Thank you, Brian.
Here in New York, I am joined, as we have been all day, by NBC News Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell, who has covered, of course, the space program for many years for us. And Bob, you know, we know what we know at this point. The evidence is very limited. We're limited to these wire service dispatches. We'll know a whole lot more at 3 o'clock when the press conference happens. But what is the early list of possible went wrongs here?
Well, the early list is that something went wrong with the tiles that caused what, when Mr. Houck was talking about the enormous heat that creates a plasma around the space shuttle as it's on re-entry. It's thousands of degrees. If there was a break in the integrity of those tiles, everyone has known all along that that could cause a space ship to break up into many pieces. There's rocket fuel on board that could cause an explosion. It was certainly something of a sudden event. So those would be my contenders for entirely on speculation. From a political standpoint, Brian, it's very interesting that Administrator O'Keefe noticed today that he had set up 2 organizations immediately to investigate this. One was a team from NASA that began its work, he said, at 9:30, which was less than 15 minutes after the shuttle had been scheduled to land in Florida. And they began their work immediately. He talked about locking down the data to make sure that nothing is inadvertently thrown out, no computer disks are inadvertently erased, that every piece of information is preserved. The information also includes everything that had to do with preparing the Columbia for launch. Don't forget that we've seen numerous times when shuttle launches are scrubbed at the last minute because things don't check out. There's checks and rechecks of all kinds of systems, and after the 1986 Challenger explosion, there was a lot of allegations that NASA had been rushing things and that the checks weren't performed as well as they had been, and there was a decisions were made to go ahead on a very cold morning that led to that problem. The other thing that NASA Administrator O'Keefe said is that he's setting up an outside board. The other thing, one of the other legacies of 1987 was that NASA did a very at first, very shoddy job of trying to investigate itself, and as we probably remember, a Blue Ribbon Commission was set up in Washington. So right away, today they're saying that NASA is not only setting up its own internal investigation, it's setting up a board of experts who are not associated with NASA to be looking at it from the outside. I think to avoid this criticism and to show that right from the very moment of this, every piece of crucial information is going to be analyzed so that the NASA officials and the rest of the country can be satisfied that they understand exactly what happened and how to fix it.
Bob Bazell with us here in our studios in New York. Bob, thank you for that, and we are duty-bound to pass along that the public does play a role in this. Any and all home videotape shot of this from any angle is now wanted badly by NASA and would be considered evidence in this investigation, because no two angles of this tragedy are the same. And they may indeed show crucial information from different vantage points across what we now know to be hundreds of miles of this country. And of course, Rick Houck just pointed out that this was above the jet stream, so that debris may be carried along quite a good distance before it is then allowed to drop from the sky. Obviously, the larger pieces would come right down. It is a few minutes before the hour of 2 o'clock Eastern, and we have just learned we will hear from the president in the cabinet room in 3 to 4 minutes' time here. NBC News White House correspondent David Gregory has been on standby all day long for us. David, evidently they came back to the White House and got right to work on a statement for the nation.
They did. They came back in a hurry after what we have now heard was a pretty busy morning for this president, who was called by the administrator of NASA just after communications were lost with Columbia. Tom Ridge, who is, of course, the Secretary of Homeland Security, also received a phone call. The president, Mr. O'Keefe said, promised full support, all the resources that were necessary. Tom Ridge then implemented that order by putting into motion a series of steps that were taken both locally and on a federal level. The president has been in communication with family members, too. We learned from Mr. O'Keefe, those family members who were gathered in Florida waiting for their loved ones to return from this important and dangerous mission, a mission that has turned to disaster, as we have heard NASA officials explain it. This is a moment for the president, as he has done in other moments like this, to reflect the grief of the country, to talk about the heroism and the danger that these astronauts face, and to pay tribute to them. His senior staff has been in place for hours here at the White House, talking to one another and communicating with the president as well. And we know, Brian, in moments like this, that there are some key players. Michael Gerson, who is, of course, the chief speechwriter for the president, Karen Hughes, an outside advisor who often plays a role, Dan Bartlett, the communications advisor, and others, including the national security team that has been in place for some time here to advise the president and help him craft a message, as is the duty of a president in such a time of grief like this. We recall back in 1986 when President Reagan spoke so eloquently in the aftermath of the Challenger disaster. Now this president faced with a similar task. It's also worth noting, Brian, as we await the president in the cabinet room, that administration officials have been saying for hours now that there is no indication that this is anything but an accident. While an investigation is still in the beginning phases as to what went wrong here, those certainly around them asking questions about whether terrorism could play a role. Officials making very clear that they have no evidence to point them in that direction.
And Brian. David, as you're speaking, let's see if we can't take a shot of Mission Control, which I've just noticed switching around here in the studio is a very, very somber sight. They're all standing, either listening to something we can't see off camera, like an address from a colleague or boss, or they are standing awaiting, as we are, the president's live address from the cabinet room. But a somber and extraordinary sight there. All of these people who were so hard at work and happy after a successful mission are now engaging in something else entirely. We're standing by to take the feed live of the president from the cabinet room at the White House. And David, we don't know much about when this is coming up. We normally get a 2-minute warning from the White House. It's now officially 2 p.m. and 15 seconds. So, David, I know this, as you mentioned, was fairly hastily arranged.
It was, and it's been pulled together really in the last couple of hours. We heard early on from administration officials that the president would, of course, speak to the nation, but they wanted here to make sure that NASA would speak first. That has happened. We know in that interim period that language was being drafted, all of the measures taken to put this kind of thing into motion to be able to broadcast it live. That has happened, and so we will await the final word, as this president has to again address the country at a time of such grief that he last faced in the aftermath, of course, of September 11th, when he, of course, was in Florida and addressed the country from various places around the country in a time of grief. This is, as I think it bears repeating, not a national emergency that continues to develop, but a national tragedy that continues to unfold. That's the guidance that we have gotten repeatedly from White House officials, and so the president will reflect on a mission that, as you pointed out, was not something that Americans were thinking a great deal about, but those people in that room were thinking about it minute by minute, and the loved ones of the family members, those 7 astronauts on board who were gathered to greet their loved ones from an important mission, a dangerous mission, something that is still on the outer limits of adventure in this country. This is now the time for the president to reflect on that. As these Americans have been lost.
The president is indeed there. They are getting ready to give him the cue to go, but he is standing by in the cabinet room. Among our other satellite sources here in New York, also available to us, is Channel 2 News in Tel Aviv, a local newscast in that city where it's the night of the Sabbath now, going on late evening, and they have suffered a terrible loss. This decorated national hero, Israeli fighter pilot, Ilan Ramon, who went down as one of the 7 today, a huge national tragedy in the nation of Israel, a nation which does not usually even divulge the names and identities of its fighter pilots lest they get shot down in the hostile territory that surrounds them. But in this case, they have made quite a national celebration out of his presence on this mission. At mission control, they remain standing. We all remain in a waiting position for the president, who was just seen very, very briefly as cameras began to focus in on him. They are making some lighting and microphone adjustments in the cabinet room. All of us waiting for him to speak are in the same boat. We will put it right on the air the minute the White House patches the address through to us.
Brian, I might also mention, we often think about the vice president in situations like this as well. Dick Cheney, not in Washington. He was actually hunting today in Texas, nowhere near the site of the explosion, and he is not returning to Washington. He's obviously in a secure place as the president continued to monitor events here.
It is one of these rare days where Americans, David, are huddled around television sets. You can count them on the fingers of one hand in the last 10 years. Some of them have involved personalities. Some of them, as we now know, of course, national tragedies. This was feared to involve a lot more than just a catastrophic spacecraft failure, but thankfully for the nation, it is only that. We say that, of course, but now falls such great grief to these families and to this president, David, and we talked about this earlier, the task once again of being a mourner in chief, and here is President Bush.
My fellow Americans, this day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country. At 9 o'clock this morning, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with our Space Shuttle Columbia. A short time later, debris was seen falling from the skies above Texas. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. On board was a crew of 7. Colonel Rick Husband, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, Commander Laurel Clark, Captain David Brown, Commander William McCool, Dr. Kulpna Shavla, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity. In an age when space flight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket and the difficulties of navigating the fierce outer atmosphere of the Earth. These astronauts knew the dangers, and they faced them willingly, knowing they had a high and noble purpose in life. Because of their courage and daring and idealism, we will miss them all the more. All Americans today are thinking as well of the families of these men and women who have been given this sudden shock and grief. You're not alone. Our entire nation grieves with you. And those you loved will always have the respect and gratitude of this country. The cause in which they died will continue. Mankind is led into the darkness beyond our world by the inspiration of discovery and the longing to understand. Our journey into space will go on. In the skies today, we saw destruction and tragedy. Yet farther than we can see, there is comfort and hope. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls them each by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. The same Creator who names the stars also knows the names of the 7 souls we mourn today. The crew of the Shuttle Columbia did not return safely to Earth, yet we can pray that all are safely home. May God bless the grieving families, and may God continue to bless America.
The President appearing to go back to the podium after his live address from the Cabinet room, and one would presume perhaps he is taping another set of remarks for another audience, perhaps even for a broadcast on Israeli television tonight. The President saying the mission will go on. He invoked religion and a higher power, as Ronald Reagan did with such effectiveness after the loss of the Challenger astronauts in his famous slip the surly bonds of Earth speech at that time, when the nation was in grief over the loss of 7 astronauts, as it is today. They were all extraordinary people of extraordinary accomplishment. Many of them officers in the U.S. Armed Forces, many of them pilots. We have for you now...
15 days ago, Commander Rick Husband, the Air Force Colonel from Amarillo, who was the commander, and Bill McCool, the Navy commander from Lubbock, who was the pilot on this. They were, of course, to the best of our knowledge, under the control of the computers as they began this re-entry process. But they're a very independent lot, these astronauts, over the years, particularly the pilots and the commanders, going all the way back to the Mercury programs when they said, thank you very much, we are not just... In the early days of the program, you remember we sent chimps, and the Russians sent dogs into space. And a very conscious political decision in the early days of the American space program to make the pilots, the astronauts, the very singular stars of the program. And it was one of the ways, of course, perhaps the crucial way in which the American public came to identify with discovery in space, was that all of the astronauts became so extraordinarily familiar. I don't know precisely who that is, but it may be Laurel Clark, one of the 2 women on board. She'd been a medical officer in submarines, who became an astronaut in 1996. And this was, of course, a scientific mission. As the President and others have pointed out, this was pushing back just not only the frontiers of space, as always. Here on the near side, by the way, that's Michael Anderson, the payload commander, and pushing not only space, but pushing science. And there were a lot of science projects on this particular mission that made it very connected to people in business and in scientific research and in schools throughout the country who all had some connection to this particular mission. We are joined on the phone this morning by an old friend of ours and one of the true stars of the Apollo space program, Gene Cernan. Gene, can you hear me?
I sure can, Peter.
You're at home in Houston, are you, this morning?
Yeah, I just walked in, sort of like everyone else, overpowered by the events.
Well, just to remind folks who you are, Gene Cernan is the last man to have walked on the moon in the American moon program. Talk a little, Gene, if you would, about the space community to which I know you're still very deeply attached.
Well, I think everyone probably has a feeling of emptiness. We can say that it's risky. We can talk about how the fact that it's going to happen again. We can say we expect these kind of things, but excuse me, that doesn't really help. When they happen, they all sort of hit us in the gut. And I think everyone in the entire space community feels that way. I haven't been officially involved in almost 30 years now, and yet we're still all part of one family. I think even though I haven't flown a shuttle, you tend to know what they're going through and the commitment they have to do the job they're doing, and that's why it hurts even more.
Gene, I think we actually just celebrated your 30th anniversary of your walk, if your walk on the moon. There's always been, and I don't want to make light of this, there's always been a bit of bravado in the space community about danger. You talk a little bit about danger. I think you did in your book.
Well, yeah, you don't. People always ask about were you scared and talk about fear, and I think we even who go. Those of us who fly, we don't overlook it. We tend to think that we can manage it. And I guess you know me well enough, Peter. There's things that become more important than being scared when you go to the moon or when you're flying a space shuttle. And it's those important things. It's a commitment. It's something you believe in. It's something you think is worthwhile. Are we willing to give our lives? Are we willing to get stuck on a moon? Well, I didn't go to the moon not to come home. I had every intention of returning. I didn't go to be a martyr. And so not surviving never really crossed my mind, although in the back of it somewhere I knew that it was possible. I knew that it could happen.
Gene, there was a time in the space program when I won't use the word cowboys, but it was all about adventure. And of course, this was a scientific mission this morning, and at least two of the people on board, Kalpana Chawla, born in India, emigrated here, and Laurel Clark, two women, have gone into space for science in this particular case. Did you feel the space program give way from adventure to space, to science, or was the adventure always there?
Well, I think the adventure was there, and I think the adventure is still there. Anyone who has gone or is going or recently been on board a shuttle, let me tell you, it's adventurous. It's adventurous to go into space. It's adventurous to try to fly around the world and at those speeds. Yeah, it doesn't have, and I may be one of the ones who's guilty of being a little critical. It doesn't have the hoopla of going to the moon, but in retrospect, it's exciting, it's adventurous, and those young men and women in today's program, many of whom are really literally young enough to be my sons and daughters, are just as committed and just as excited about going. It's just, there's nothing routine, there's nothing rote about it. Yes, it's scientific. Their goal in life is to come back with something that has significant meaning for the future of the people on this earth, and they're working very hard to make that happen.
Do you think NASA is still as conscientious as it was in your day?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about it. Perhaps even more conscientious, and we'll probably get a full realization of that, because it's going to be, whose guess, a year or more before we ever unscramble what really happened, what caused, if it was a breakup, what caused the breakup, and get it solved and get on with it. But I'm one of those who believes, we will find a problem, we will get it solved, and we will be back. There's no question in my mind that in the long run we will prevail.
Gene, it is good and reassuring to hear your voice. I'm sorry about the circumstances, as we know, but it's good to hear your voice.
Peter, we ought to get together once in a while on happier times. It's unfortunate we have to wait until a situation like this, but I guess it brings to life what is really happening and something that a lot of people consider, routine.
I'll call you. Thanks, Gene.
God bless, Peter. Thank you.
Gene Cernan, the last American to walk on the moon, which takes us to Jim Slade in Washington, another of our space consultants. Jim, listening to the president, who says inevitably, as he must at the moment, that the loss of life today will inspire the space program in some way. The tradition is that it has both inspired progress and sometimes retarded it, right?
That's true. I would think in this case NASA is in some need of an improvement in the shuttle system over the next few years, although these are destined to last a lot longer than now. I would wonder if the president has any of that in mind. He sent Sean O'Keefe over to NASA to become a budgeteer and to whip things into shape in that place. And there has been a long-standing program to develop a second-generation shuttle, Peter, one that would be simpler to fly and quicker to fly. These things stand down for 2 or 3 months at least between each flight while they're groomed.